Hi, welcome to Physionic, where we learn the body from the macro to the micro. If that's something you think you'd be interested in, then consider subscribing. In today's examined content, we're going to be discussing a paper that looks into how aging affects our muscular power production. So if you're interested, you can check out the paper. It is open access. I will have it linked to this content, and you can check it out for yourself. But without further ado, let's dissect this paper. All right, to introduce this real quick, I've already mentioned it at the introduction of the content in general, but we see that the paper is trying to look at what happens at different time points, different ages for muscular power production. And that's it. That's what they want to find out. If you're older, how do you compare to somebody who is an adult? So with that said, let's jump into the methods of the experiment. This paper looked at mice, so we're looking at young to adult age mice, talking in the range of 5 to 7 months, and then we're looking at older mice, that's how I'll characterize them, roughly 22 to 26 months old, and then you've got our elderly mice, which are 28 months old. Now a mouse, if it extends to a lifespan of about 3 years, that is really pushing the lifespan of a mouse. So they looked at mice that were at least over 2 years old for their old and their elderly conditions, which is definitely a positive to see, at least when it comes to muscle research. Then they measured the power outputs of two different sets of muscles, the EDL and the soleus, which are both found in the leg. Humans have these muscles as well, and the advantage that you get from using mouse research in this particular situation is in humans you could do something called an in vivo experiment, in which the person obviously is alive, and you just have them contract against a particular machine. However, in animals we can sacrifice the animal and we can take out their muscles and then just measure the muscle itself in a linear fashion through what's called a force transducer, and then from there we can also make measurements on power. So it's an incredibly specific and highly accurate fashion to figure out power production in musculature. Now the other two things that I wanted to quick mention is that they briefly go over cross-sectional area. Cross-sectional area is essentially if you were to, let's say, cut a muscle in half and then look into it. So instead of, well, if you have your arm like this, you cut it down the middle and then you point that section towards your face so you can actually see how thick it is. That would be cross-sectional area. Now, they also looked at muscle mass, so the actual weight of the muscle, and of course they have to do that. They can do that through taking the muscle out of the animal and then just weighing it. So this paper is going to look at power, it's going to look at muscle mass, hypertrophy or atrophy, more aptly put in this situation, and cross-sectional area, which also tells you about atrophy and really the condition of the muscle. So with that said, let's jump into the results. Before I jump into the specifics of the different figures that we're going to be going through, and I don't cover every single figure, I just cover kind of the main ones, so you can follow along with those, and of course you're welcome to check out any of the other figures because again the paper, the study will be linked for your convenience. So you can look through it yourself and have your own critical eye on it. With that said though, I do want to make the distinction between force and power. So force is essentially the most amount of effort that's required to move an object. So just being able to move it in general is the amount of force that's required to move that object, the amount of effort that's required to move any object. So if that's to move 200 pounds, you're going to require X amount of force to be able to move that 200 pounds. Now, if you use the exact same amount of force for a weight that's 300 pounds, it will not move that weight because the weight is higher than the force that you're applying. If you're able to increase the amount of force that you apply onto that weight, then it will move if you exceed that 300-pound threshold. So that's just force. Just think force, being able to move an object in general. That's it. Power, on the other hand, takes force, so that exact definition, and if you move at a particular distance, how quickly can you move that object from point A to point B? So it takes force, and it also includes velocity. So it also includes the speed by which you're able to move the object. So again, force is just moving the object. Can you move the object? Yes, no. Power is how quickly can you move that object. That's it. I need you to know that because going forward we're going to be looking mostly at power, but I am going to briefly mention a little bit on force as well. Now, looking at figure 1. So we're looking specifically at figure 1A and C for those top two figures, and that is going to be again EDL, which is a more fast twitch muscle. It's more of a glycolytic muscle. It's more of a power force generating muscle, something that you would think of to move larger objects. And then you've got your soleus, which is more of a red fibered muscle. It's more of a slow twitch muscle. It's far more long acting, so it can contract many times over a long period of time, but doesn't generate a lot of force. And what we find is that with different percentages of force that are applied, let's say 40% of force, 80% of force, they've got that scale right on that x-axis, you see that you're going to see decreases in velocity. And that makes sense, because if you have to generate more and more force just to move an object, that means that many neurons have to activate many different fibers to lead to the force generation. It's not like we go from 0 force immediately to 90% force, for example. We have a gradation period. We have a slow increase. Well, slow is really relative to the power, because again, that velocity measurement, but you can compare relative to age. So when we're looking at our younger individuals, or younger mice, our adult mice, I should say, compared to our elderly, we can see that there's a significant drop, at the very least, to go from our adult to our old or elderly. And there doesn't seem to be as much of a difference between the old or elderly based on this graph in terms of the velocity that we can move, or the mice can move the object that they're trying to move. So obviously they're going to be much quicker to move an object that's only presenting them with about 20% resistance, because they can generate 20% force incredibly quickly, and that's high power. Of course, that makes sense. But then as you get to, let's say, 80%, suddenly the velocity decreases substantially, because generating enough force for that 20%, you only need a few different fibers. So your muscle is going to go through that and activate those very quickly. But for the 80% amount of resistance, you're going to have that 20% increase suddenly, and your body's like, oh, we need more. Okay, so it jumps up to 40%. Okay, then it jumps up to 60%. That object isn't moving though. So then it needs to jump up to 80%. And then the object will move, because it's moving as quickly as it possibly can from that point on. And that's where we get our measurement of actual power, because again, we're taking velocity and we're taking force. Now you'll notice that at P0 100%, that means that you're in a tetanic state. That means your muscle is completely contracting maximally. Your neurons are firing as quickly as they can. Every single fiber is contracting, and you've essentially maxed out. You simply cannot move that object. That would be considered a isometric contraction, meaning that the muscle isn't going to lengthen and it's not going to shorten, because you're using everything that muscle has and it just can't move the object. You just can't generate enough force to move that object. So that's an isometric contraction. And of course, you're not going to see differences between the adult mice compared to the old or the elderly mice, because there is no power output. You're not getting any velocity because you're not moving the object in the first place. You first have to have force enough to move the object, then you can actually measure the velocity of how quickly you're moving that object from point A to point B. That makes complete sense. But the big takeaway here is that you are seeing a decrease in power across a wide variety of different power measurements, or at different resistances. If that's 40% of maximal force, if that's 60%, 80%, etc., you still see that decrease. The next figure is certainly dense. It's dense with a lot of different numbers, but don't worry, you don't have to actually dissect each one of those numbers. All you're looking for is trends. So what they're looking at is across different force percentages, kind of like what we saw in the previous figure, how quickly can they move the object? So what is the maximal level of quickness or velocity? So not only can they just move it with a certain level of speed, but what is the maximal amount or the maximal speed by which they can move that particular object? And it turns out that the trend is, of course, that the adult mice are going to have the best or the fastest velocity across essentially all the different percentages of force. And of course, if you look at the elderly, you're going to have decreases, so they're not going to be as quick. At their peak levels, you're going to see decreases in that peak level compared to the adult. And the same would be true for the old, which are kind of in between the two. But of course, the older are a little bit closer to the elderly mice. So P max is the maximum velocity that was ever achieved across any of the variables that they looked at. And again, although it's certainly high for all three, because it is the maximum, it still decreases with age. And then they looked at what percent, the force percent, that was achieved, that velocity, that maximal velocity was achieved. And you find that it's relatively similar, but there is enough of a difference there. So it's around that 30% mark, which isn't shocking because 30% is right around where you could develop the most amount or a significant amount of power. One final point I wanted to touch on here is if you compare the EDL to the soleus, the actual power numbers are massively different. I've already alluded to this before, but the soleus muscle is certainly going to have much lower power values than the EDL. Figure 2 is a relatively simple figure. Essentially what they're showing is that you're going to see decrements in the power production or the velocity with age. We already know that, but what this actually also adds on to is that even though you see decreases in power, you see greater decreases in power at higher force production. So if once you get up to, like, let's say 60, 80, 90%, the power production is even lower than if you were to compare it to a mouse that's trying to generate power or force at a quickened pace at 20 or 40%. So you're going to see decreases all the way across, but definitely near that top end when you're trying to move an incredibly heavy object. Then that force production, the velocity of that force production, is going to be even more impacted at those higher ends. Figure 4A and C are again looking at EDL and soleus. If you look at the y-axis, you're looking at the millinewtons times fiber length, so talking about the actual muscle fiber, over seconds. So again, they're looking at speed in that particular section of the units. So the blue line is your baseline, essentially. That's what your adult mice are producing in terms of power. Then you've got your line under that, which is your older mice, and then you've got your last line, which is your elderly line. And that's of course going to be lower than, well, both of the others, but especially the adult. And what they find in terms of percentages for the EDL is a 20% decrease in power output on average from the adult to the old, so that middle line. and then a further 29% decline from old to elderly. So you're getting, over 40%, almost 50% decline from the adult to the elderly when it comes to your EDL muscle. Now, interestingly enough, for the soleus, even though the overall absolute power outputs are going to be certainly lower across the board compared to EDL, if you just look at soleus itself, you see the exact same trend. But what's actually really interesting here is that even though you see a massive jump from the adult to the old by a 32% decrease in power output, you don't find a significant decrease. And this is, I realize that it seems like if you look at it, just like by looking at it with your eyeballs, that you're going to see a continuing decrease in power from the old to the elderly, but statistically, it is not significant. Now, the reason for that is most likely because of the variability that you see there for the old mice. So I'm sure that if they added a few more mice to that group, I would imagine that you would start to see significant decreases between the old and the elderly. But as it stands right now, you only see decreases from adult to the old, but you don't see any statistically significant decreases between the old and the elderly in terms of power production. Pretty interesting. The final figure or table that I wanted to discuss is Table 2. Table 2 looks at kind of the other aspects, so aside from power, looking at force, looking at muscle mass, looking at your physiological cross-sectional area, which I explained earlier. So in terms of body weight, you do see some significant differences in body weight. So interestingly enough, that could be a confounder. I think it's less so confounder mainly because you have a non-significant difference in body weight with the adult and their extreme, the elderly, but you do see an increase in body weight with the old mice. So is it probably a confounder? Most likely not, but it's something that I think is important to point out. The other thing they looked at was the muscle mass, and what they found is that the EDL was the only one that was significantly decreased in muscle mass. So you have atrophy in the EDL, but you don't have atrophy, or at least not statistically significant atrophy when it comes to the soleus. Most likely over time you would have atrophy in both, however. So that's kind of interesting. So maybe it is more specific to type 2 muscle fibers, more specific to those high glycolytic, those fast twitch muscle fibers. Another interesting tidbit is that they looked at cross-sectional area, and of course, if you're going to have decreases in muscle mass, most likely you're going to see decreases in cross-sectional area, and that's exactly what they found. But again, they only found that in the EDL, so you see that the overall diameter of the muscle shrinks with the EDL, and certainly quite a lot when it comes to the elderly mice. And then they looked at force production. So we're not looking at power, we're not looking at velocity, we're just looking at, can these mice move an object? That's it. That's all that force really tells you. And what they find is, again, you see decreases, which makes sense. If you're going to lose muscle mass, if you're going to lose cross-sectional area, then of course most likely you're going to lose force as well. But they only lost force in the EDL. Now, I will quick mention that they were incredibly close to significance on the soleus muscle if you compare the adult soleus muscle to the elderly soleus muscle. It was unbelievably close, so most likely eventually it was also going to happen there as well, so force production was going to be lower. Now, the final point, and I'm probably going to try and create some specific content to this as well, is that, and they only have a quick blurb on this, but this is interesting, that if you normalize the cross-sectional area to the force production per unit of whatever unit you end up using for cross-sectional area, you're going to have the same amount of force production. So what does that imply? Well, that implies that if you were able to maintain cross-sectional area through something like exercise, then you might be able to maintain force production for a lot longer than you could maintain power production, or at least, and maybe even ameliorate some if not all, but most likely just some of the power decrements that you see with age. So per unit of cross-sectional area, you're getting the same force production, which is really, really interesting, but they don't go into it. Okay, so let's discuss what we can take away from this paper. What were kind of the key points that they got across with this study? It turns out that, well, with age, you see decreases in power. Not a huge shock there. Of course you're going to see decreases in power. And that is especially true for the EDL muscle. So again, those fast twitch glycolytic muscles. Interestingly enough, when you look at power measurements, and well, just force as well, but certainly power, because that's the main outcome that they were looking at. If you look at power in those higher force productions, you're going to see a faster decline or a greater decline in power output at higher forces compared to kind of on the lower end of that scale at 20-40% or even lower than that in terms of force production. So that's something that's really interesting as well. The next point is force production decreases with age. So power production decreases with age, force production decreases with age, and that is going to be far more dependent on cross-sectional area, which again, they just had literally one line, but they quick mentioned that you don't see a difference in the ages when you normalize that force production, that decrease in force production to cross-sectional area, which means that, again, per unit of cross-sectional area, essentially if you can keep the muscle large and hypertrophied, then you're going to be able to produce at least similar amounts of force, even if you can't necessarily produce the same levels of power. And another point is that you see decreases in force with the EDL especially, and you don't see as many decreases or significant decreases until you reach elderly for those soleus muscles. So again, those slower twitch, red fibered muscles. So what can we take away from this in terms of applicable information for us? Well, weightlifting is incredibly important. No shocker there, but specifically focusing on power. So you don't necessarily want to just focus on muscle hypertrophy, although that will have a massive impact on force. It's not going to have necessarily the greatest impact on power production. So focusing on lower repetitions and higher percentage intensity, so aiming for that 80% of 1 rep max, as well as higher than that, can maybe, and well, let's be honest, most likely help maintain your power production, as well as if you increase volume, then you're also going to increase that cross-sectional area and maintain force. So in many ways, this is telling us that powerlifting is just as important as going for something like bodybuilding or endurance training and things of that nature, because as we age, of course, the ability for us to catch ourselves during a fall or things of that nature are going to be based on velocity. If you trip, your ability to catch yourself when you're young is incredibly quick. I mean, your brain, your neurons, everything fires very quickly, so you're able to put your leg out there and catch yourself without any problems. But once you're 60, 70, 80 years old, and especially if you're getting into the 80, 90, 100 years old, that power production is massively decreased to the point where you may trip, and if you were younger by 60 years, you'd be able to catch yourself because your velocity is very quick, again, power, then you can't catch yourself even though you've thought, oh, I need to catch myself. Your muscles may not react fast enough and with enough force to be able to fully catch yourself, and that's where we get, hips breaking, other issues from just falling down. So it's incredibly important, especially later on in life. But certainly if you can maintain that throughout your entire life, have a powerlifting spin to your routine, that's going to help you mitigate many and maybe even potentially completely offset a lot of these issues down the road when it comes to sarcopenia, or the loss of muscle mass, or muscle power production from aging. So there you have it, guys. That's what I've got for you. Hopefully you found this informative, and I hope that I have the absolute pleasure of speaking with you in the very next one. Have a good one, guys. Bye.